This is a program I've been looking forward to for several years. The state of North Carolina has led the nation in pharmacists in migration. And the most common name of pharmacists in North Carolina is Patel. My neighbors, I have one house close to me, and I've had three sets of neighbors. The first was from Michigan, the second from Ohio, and my wonderful neighbors living there now are from Russia. I'm here to explain to us why this is happening to North Carolina is Jess Stanford. She got a BS in geographic science from James Madison, and I know she was interested in what Jesus was eating because sustainable food systems is one of her specialties, along with sustainable development, environmental conservation, and something that I hope she'll tell me what is applied GIS. And in looking her up, she on one of her websites has said that 100 years ago, 90% of the North Carolinians were from North Carolina, were born in North Carolina, 90%. And as of 2 years ago, only 56% were born in North Carolina. And here from out of state somewhere, I think we have Jess Stanford. Welcome, Jess.
Thank you for that introduction. And yes, I am one of the many out-of-state people who have moved here. I moved here from Virginia about 3 years ago. So do I have, let's see, I'm going to share my screen and let's make sure I have screen sharing abilities now. Can you all see the presentation?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. And then I will. Okay, so I'm going to speak with you all today about the 4 major trends that are taking place in North Carolina's population, the major demographic trends, what they look like now, and how they will look in the near future through the mid-2030s. But before I do that, I'd like to give you all a little more background on who we are. So Carolina Demography, we are a research consulting service within UNC's Carolina Population Center. And we work with a variety of clients throughout the state, as well as students and the media to help everyone understand the basic question of where North Carolina's population is headed. And we do that doing 4 major research products. So we help our clients understand what their data needs are, and we can help refine research questions and identify the data that they'll need. We provide analysis and interpretation services. We will also produce population estimates and projections if that's something that's needed. And then we give presentations like this one and workshops throughout the state. And while a lot of people may not be familiar with the word demography or demographics, it really is just the study of population growth and change. And when you consider that kind of data, you can see how it has applications across a wide variety of needs. So I'm going to cover the 4 major demographic stories in North Carolina. If you remember anything from this presentation, I'd like you to remember these 4. These are the trends that have defined North Carolina's growth, particularly from 1990 to present day. And they are the trends that will continue to shape North Carolina's population in the future. So naturally, you can't talk about population change in North Carolina without talking about growth. So as a state, our population has grown faster than the United States every year since 1970. We really hit a growth spurt in the 1990s and early 2000s prior to the recession, where North Carolina saw an explosion of growth. And prior to 1990, which I like to focus my research on 1990 onward, because that is really the year that North Carolina shifted from a primarily rural agricultural state to a state where that is defined by many different knowledge sector industries. In 1990, only 50% of the population lived in an urban area. And then as of 2010, which is the latest year we have data for that, it's over 65% now living in an urban area. Place very rapidly, but it's kind of limited to a few key areas throughout the state. And so along with the population growth that North Carolina has seen, the job market really began to shift. And now North Carolina's key industries are around banking and healthcare, and of course the tech jobs here in the Triangle. And so that has further driven growth in the Charlotte Metro, the Durham, Raleigh Metro, et cetera. Which ties into the next point about urbanization. Like I said, now the majority of people living in the state live in an urban area, and that wasn't true even just a few decades prior. And the urbanization that's taking place here is also deepening what some demographers call the rural-urban divide. So the urban areas, particularly the Charlotte and Raleigh metros, are really the two places that are attracting the most in-migrants from other states, like myself. In addition, they are also pulling a lot of the young adults, whether they're college age or young workers from rural areas in North Carolina who are seeking employment and education opportunities. So over time, our urban populations continue to grow through those two means, and rural areas become increasingly more sparsely populated. And then the third trend that's taking place in North Carolina, and really taking place all across the country, is a shift in our age structure. The baby boomer generation is the largest living generation in the United States. And as of 2011, the first members of that generation turned 65. So just in the last decade, we've been seeing a huge growth in that like prime retirement age group. And through the 2030s, some of our counties in North Carolina are going to become heavily elderly. And that definitely has implications for what kind of services will be needed in the future. It's a major reason driving the job growth and healthcare in our state. Impacts than simply there are more people who are retired. And then the last trend taking place in North Carolina is that we are becoming more diverse. 1990, that key year I mentioned, North Carolina was 3/4 white, and the majority of non-white residents here were either Black or American Indian. But then over the course of the next 2 decades, we have seen really quick growth in the Hispanic, Asian, and multiracial groups. And to this day, those groups tend to be the fastest growing, and our white, Black, and American Indian groups are our slowest growing demographic groups. So I'm going to dive in a little deeper. I've mentioned that we're growing, but a lot of it is concentrated in just a few of our key urban areas. All told, from 1990 to last year, North Carolina has added almost 4 million new residents. And through 2035, that is expected to, those patterns of growth are expected to continue and deepen. So this map here shows projected population growth from 2010, the last census year, through 2035. And the darkest blue counties represent the fastest growing areas. So you can see that they are really in the Raleigh metro, the Charlotte metro, and Wilmington metro. Now, some of our other metropolitan areas like the Triad or Asheville out west are going to experience population growth as well, but it's really not going to be at the same speed as those three previous areas. And that really is tied to the fact that those areas have set themselves apart in this kind of shifting job market. Meanwhile, outside of our major metro areas, the majority of counties are going to lose population. You can see two of the hardest hit areas are the Northeast and Sandhills between Charlotte and Wilmington. The counties, particularly in the Northeast, have had a long-standing trend of population loss. Some of them began losing population as early as the 1980s, and those trends are going to continue. Particularly, as I mentioned, a lot of the young individuals and prime working age population are leaving those rural areas and moving into the metropolitan places nearby. And to really drive home just how much growth is going to be attributed just from the Triangle in Charlotte, over 2/3 of the growth is in those two areas. The growth rates for the Triad, Wilmington, Asheville, and all other smaller metros will not even equal to just the growth rate of either the Triangle or Charlotte. So that growth is very, very concentrated. And overall, projections indicate that rural areas still will have some amount of growth through the next decade, but it's probably going to take place mostly out west, where we have been seeing a lot of influx of retirees. Outside of Asheville and around Black Mountain have been some really attractive areas. And then some areas around the coast that are considered more rural. But all told, our growth is concentrated and the job market really is the reason why. 70% of the new jobs that were created from 2010 to 2019 were just in 10 urban counties. And just so we're all on the same page, North Carolina has 100 counties. So that means the remaining 30% of new jobs were distributed among 90 other counties. It's really interesting how much this growth is just in a few key areas. And migration from individuals like myself, as well as individuals from foreign countries, has played a key role in North Carolina's growth in the last few decades. So this graph here, I'm going to compare that is when a population has more births than deaths. And you can see this is North Carolina's natural increase rate annually from 1990. And you can see that it's been kind of level. After we saw some shifting of the age structure after 2010 and baby boomers started to age out of the population of the prime childbearing years, we kind of saw a downward shift in our natural increase rate, but it's been pretty stable here in North Carolina. On the other hand, this is our net migration rate, and that is basically the sum of people moving into the area versus people moving out. So if it's positive, you have more people moving in than moving away. And you can see that it's way more volatile than the natural increase rate. It's really tied to economic forces. When jobs are abundant and housing is cheap, people are going to move to the area. You see that in the 90s around the dot-com bubble, and it spiked again right before the recession. And then it had a pretty sharp downward spike after the recession until about the mid 2010s. And now we're really seeing a rebound of those numbers. And what's really interesting is, so I mentioned before, we've added about 3.7 million residents, and 2.7 of them were net migrants. The remainder were individuals born in North Carolina. So that means approximately 70% of the new people that have been added to our population have been people that have moved here. And that ratio of like 70-30 migration to natural increase, that's held pretty steady through the past few decades. But what's really going to change in this decade and the next is we are going to rely almost exclusively on net migration to grow. And the reason for that is, so white North Carolinians are the largest group numerically in the state. There are more individuals who are white than any other group, and they are also the oldest racial and ethnic group in the state. So as we see the aging out of childbearing years of white North Carolinians, it's having a pretty major impact on our natural increase rate. And it's going to get to the point where migration is the only means through which we grow. Is to make itself an attractive state to individuals, continues to have cutting edge technologies and new job growth, because we're really dependent on it. And so while those forces of migration and population growth are taking place and how it's driving urbanization, simultaneously, we're seeing this population aging. And this is a result of obviously much broader trends from the result of the baby boomers aging up, the biggest generation currently alive. There will be 93,000 approximately people who are of key retirement age, more than the next two age groups combined. It is going to be a very massive growth in this demographic group. And just over a third, 37 counties in our state, will actually have over 1 in 4 people who are 65 plus, and by 2035. And while this sounds like, wow, that's going to be a really far off, crazy thing one day in the future, it's not necessarily the case. There are counties already today that have this ratio. Those rural counties, particularly in the Northeast, have already met this 1 in 4 ratio today. And that raises some real questions about how can those counties account for the fact that most of their population is now non-working if they are retired or on disability as they become elderly, and other things like rural hospitals have been closing. There are fewer resources for people to access medical care. This population aging is raising some big questions about how we can provide services to people who are rural and less mobile. And so while we are aging, we are also growing more diverse with every generation. And I mentioned before, a major part of that is the fact that white North Carolinians tend to be elderly. The median age for white residents here in the state is 44, which means that half of white residents here are older than 44 and half are younger than that. But that means a huge percent, or a large percentage of that population is no longer of prime childbearing years. Compare that to the Hispanic population in North Carolina. That's the youngest community here in the state. And the median age for that is 22. So many individuals who are Hispanic living here have not really even aged into typical childbearing family years. A lot of them are younger. And that is really reflective in the growth rate. That is why the Hispanic population is the third fastest growing group. Now, the very fastest growing group, Asian North Carolinians, they are also tend to be growing faster because they are a younger demographic. And a lot of people are still moving in groups of families from other countries. While Hispanic North Carolinians now are majority domestic, meaning over 50% of those residents have been born here, Asian residents in the state are still majority foreign born. Once that shifts and once most Asian residents here are domestic born, that growth rate will start to slow down. And then, of course, our second fastest growing group, multiracial, that is really very much related to the fact that as our population becomes more diverse, there are more children born to mixed race marriages. And additionally, that demographic category has only become available more recently. So more people are starting to identify as that as they become aware of it. And that's really that shift in demographics has really not yet been reflected in our workforce. People who are 20 years and older today, you can see are still just over 2/3 white, but students in the elementary and middle school population, the under 10, are only about 51% white. So there's going to be a real change in just a decade or so in what North Carolina's workforce is going to look like. And so those are the major trends that are taking place. And if we still have some time, I'd love to dive into how those trends translate to the census and a little bit about the election, the two big things taking place in 2020 besides the pandemic.
You're good to go. You've got time. Go ahead.
Okay. So as you all know, the 2020 decennial census just wrapped up at the end of last week. Hopefully you all were able to send in your census or had someone, an enumerator, follow up with you, because the census is really important. It is key for what I say the two major things that the census does is give North Carolina money and power. And then, of course, economic growth and research, like what I do, is important. But the two major things we have at stake are political representation and the federal funds that we receive that are tied to the census. And first, speaking on political power, I've been really driving home today that we're growing fast, and that's reflected in the fact that we are most likely going to gain a seat in the House of Representatives because of how much growth we have seen. And we are joined by a few other states in the Sun Belt, as well as some Western states that have also been growing really fast. Meanwhile, the Midwest and the Northeast are projected to lose seats. So you can really see at the national level how those population shifts are taking place. And in case you're wondering, one of the top sending states for us, for out-of-state migrants, are New Yorkers. If you live in the Triangle, chances are you have met many of the New York, New Jersey residents who now live here. They have been one of our top sending areas for the last decade or so. And so in addition to political representation at the federal level, as well as boundary districts for the state and local, we have a lot of federal funding that's tied to the census, $44 billion annually based on our current population numbers. And so those different programs that are tied to census counts are Medicare and Medicaid, SNAP, food stamps, CHIP for young students, the Head Start early childhood program, and highways. So even if you feel like you're not using any of those programs before, we all pretty much drive places, and highway maintenance is tied to that as well. And over the last few months, we have been tracking what counties are doing really well versus what counties have not been participating super well in the census. And around here in the triangle, we have been doing quite well. Orange County in particular has been the third highest responding county in the state. But out west and on the coast, where you tend to have more vacation homes, response rates have not been so great. And that definitely has some implications for whether or not there may actually be an undercount in those places. And so simultaneously, I mean, 2020 has been a huge year. And of course, the election is right around the corner. And those shifting demographic trends, particularly the diversification of our population, is starting to be reflected in our voter base. So we gained almost 2 million new voters just since the last presidential election. And this appears to be a really contentious election because you can see that registrations for this coming presidential election have now outpaced the registrations we were seeing in 2016. So people are really trying to ensure that they participate, and hopefully we see some record-breaking voter participation in this election. At least we're seeing record-breaking registrations. And many of those new voters tend to be some of those out-of-state migrants that in terms of newly registered voters, almost half of them were from another state, while only a third were that were native to North Carolina. And 36% of new voters in North Carolina have registered Democrats. So North Carolina has about 2.5 million Democrats. Our second largest group are unaffiliated. They are also the fastest growing group. More people are leaving both the Democratic and Republican parties and are becoming unaffiliated. So that's a major trend we're seeing. And then we have about 2.1 million Republican voters in the state. And how that breaks out in terms of race and ethnicity, Democrats tend to be more diverse than all voters, and Republicans tend to be much less diverse. 90% of Republican voters are white, and just 41% are white for Democrats. But what's interesting is I mentioned a lot of people are choosing to now register unaffiliated, and you can see unaffiliated voters, their racial and ethnic breakdown tends to mimic the state overall. So I think that's really interesting. I think unaffiliated voters may best represent a sample of all people in North Carolina. It tends to be most reflective of just a wide sample. And then, of course, the pandemic has made a huge impact on whether or not people can actually show up to the polls. And this graph shows the absentee ballot requests. You can see it has gone through the roof compared to what we were seeing week by week in 2016. And we hope that those absentee ballots translate to greater voter participation this year. So those are the 4 major trends. We're aging, we're diversifying, we're growing, and we're urbanizing. Do you all have any questions about some trends that you might be seeing in your area? Oh, I see some raised hands.
I see that Jim Hevner has a question. Jim's raised his hand.
Okay, if you want to see the entire graph, you can minimize.
Okay, there we go.
Oh, that's a good recommendation, Jim. Yes, so you can move the icon.
Oh no, that was a long time ago. So 5 or 6 slides ago, under the registrations, there were 3 lines on that page going back month by month. And I looked to try to figure out whether it showed Democratic or Republican. And I could not find on that slide what those 3 lines represented. Maybe I wasn't looking closely enough.
Which graph was it?
There were years. It was 2016, 18, and 20, I think.
There you go. This one, I believe. Yes. Okay. I think that's it. What are those? I see 3 lines. And what do the 3 lines represent?
So the 3 lines represent total registrations over the course of that year. So it's all voters. So we're looking at the period from January to October. Yep, for those 3 key years. I
did have a senior moment then. You don't show, do you show, or did I miss that? Registrations, the new I think we saw the total registrations. Did we see new registrations by party since 2016?
No, I have not. I did not include that, but I would be happy to follow up with some data on that, because I think we did make another graph that just didn't make it into the presentation. Yeah. Or certainly if we don't have it, I can do a data poll for you all. This is just the party affiliation totals as of late August.
Very helpful. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Diane Smith has a question.
Jessica, I just wondered about how the pandemic was affecting your growth numbers. Are we going to see more migration into North Carolina? And then is there going to be migration from urban to rural due to the pandemic and people being more afraid in concentrated areas?
That's a great question. And it's a little too soon to be able to answer it. This data tends to have kind of a slow turnaround. And I believe the Census Bureau announced that they might be skipping the 2021 estimates. They'll report the census totals from this year, and then they'll skip to 2022 because of the pandemic. So we may not see those effects for a little while reflected in the data, but I think that's a great question, and we're going to keep an eye on that.
Thank you. Great presentation.
Jody Magnus has a question.
Mute off. Thank you for your presentation. I was just wondering, when you say, native North Carolinians versus non-native, so is your criterion strictly having been born in the state versus somebody who's maybe lived here all their life or lived here for 2 to 3 decades but was born elsewhere? Do you have any do you distinguish at all between that? Because I think there's a difference between, those kinds of groups, right?
Yes, that's a great point. And right now we only distinguish between individuals having been born there versus born somewhere else. And that's kind of how the data is structured. But I'm going to look in to see if there is another data source where we could look at years lived in the state, because I think you're right. I think once you've lived here for, say, a decade or more, you pretty much are native now. Like, this is your home. You are from that area now. So that's a great point. But no, we haven't had that reflected that yet.
Thank you.
Brian Keeliff has a question.
Jessica, could you be good enough to untangle the controversy around the census? Some people have said, oh, we've done 99%. Other people said no. Other people say we needed to have more time. Other people said, no, we're going to cut it off. So can you alleviate my confusion, please?
Sure. And well, I can try my best. So the first thing I will always try and make clear is that 99% does not reflect people. It reflects 99% of the households that the Census Bureau had on its list of places to contact. So the issue with that is, of that 99%, in North Carolina, let's see, about as of the end of the census, about 63% of those were self-responded. So either people mailing in or filling it out online. And that's great. We love to see that because those are the most accurate totals. But the remainder, about 36%, are households that enumerators had to reach out to. And that comes with significantly less accuracy. And so when individuals were pushing to extend the time, not only did they want to at least get enumerators door to door, that's better than nothing, they also wanted to extend the time that people could self-respond, because we really would prefer to have that data over enumerators. Because enumerators oftentimes, if they can't get a hold of anyone at their door, and with COVID, people aren't opening the door to strangers. They have to either interview neighbors, or they just have to statistically impute the data for that household, and it offers more error. Additionally, because there was a lot of uncertainty on when the census would end, to send out fewer enumerators even as late as late September, early as late September. And that also means that they may not have reached every household. And then, of course, on top of it, there are all the households that the Census Bureau never had on its list to begin with. So there are a few issues.
So why did it become so political? I'd have thought both Republican Democrats, both of them would be disadvantaged by not having accurate counts.
That's great. That's a great point, and it's true. Everyone is disadvantaged. It definitely became political at first when the issue of the citizenship question was raised. We saw that a lot of individuals were reporting greater uncertainty about the census. And a lot of people don't know that census data is protected. This is a nonpartisan organization. And the citizenship question deterred people, but the census itself is trying to count everyone. And so there were some issues where some individuals in Trump's cabinet too were talking about not counting undocumented people. But the census really is striving to count everybody. So those two things made it more political. And then of course, there were issues with collection due to COVID. So it faced a few challenges.
Thank you, Jessica.
We have time for one last question, and that one's going to go to Lida Coleman. Lida?
Hey, Jessica, thank you so much. That is very, very interesting. I have a question that I'm not sure whether you tabulate this kind of information or not, but given the kind of growth and diversity you're talking about, I wonder if you have any statistics about the highest level of education we're seeing in North Carolina now. Is it high school? Are there more college graduates, or do you have that sort of information?
Oh, I may have included that. Yes, so this was a slide I actually did not present. I was worried I wouldn't have enough time, but I'm going to show it to you all now. Let's see if I'll share my screen. It is, so this is comparing educational attainment for people who were born in North Carolina versus people who moved here. And so individuals who were born here tend to have a little bit lower rates, or in some cases, substantially lower rates of degree attainment, while people moving here tend to have higher rates of degree attainment from a bachelor's onward. And all told, I believe the attainment now of some degree from associates onward, it's not the majority of folks, but I think it's somewhere in 40% range, if I remember correctly. So North Carolina's population, it tends to be well educated overall. And then our in-migrants are really driving that share of degree attainees even higher.
That's very interesting. Thank you for finding that.
Sure.
Jessica, thank you so much for your time and your expertise. Very well put together presentation of some very interesting information. So we're grateful for you sharing that with us, and appreciate you joining us today.